Hi everyone, welcome to this video detailing operations and dispatching of the SLS Railroad. This video is titled Areas of the Railroad, and we'll just go over some of the areas of the railroad that are of special interest and some of the unique aspects of those areas. With that being said, let's start with our first area, Westboro River. As we detailed in our last video, ancillary panels, most of the activity that goes on at Westboro River is handled here on the Westboro River to Woodruff traffic panel. The only item of interest there is that we have on the main panel is the signal that the dispatcher would use to route a line eastbound, either onto Old Main or New Main. From there, our first big area that we get into is West Sage. West Sage has a number of trains that work this area, and on occasion the RDC, which is not regularly scheduled. Of course, all through traffic comes through here, as well as the interior Superior Paper plant is switched by the Sage Yard switcher, as well as the Sage Yard switcher goes across the main line to switch the steel mill and the industries off that steel mill lead. There are two lines that come onto the layout, or onto the signal portion at Sage Yard and the Sage Yard station lead. Just east of there we have the helper pocket. The helper pocket is where some helpers are stored, mostly for the ore train and the coal trains that go into the steel mill at Sage, and they use this to place their helpers on and off of their trains and to put them away. Over here at Sandy Creek is just a standard OS, but between West Sandy Creek OS and East Sage is a very short area, as well as the area between East Sage and East Sandy Creek. These blocks here and the other block at between East Sage and East Sandy Creek here cannot hold a train between the West Sandy Creek OS and the East Sage, and likewise the East Sage OS and the East Sandy Creek OS. So a full train would fit the confines of between West Sandy Creek OS and East Sandy Creek OS, and would encompass as well East Sage. The sidings are of comparative length, so you can fit a full train in there without fouling either ends of the OS. Bridge Intermediate, as we detailed in overview of panel and orientation, is a automated signal. In intermediate, it will automatically go ahead and upgrade and drop as conditions ahead of it change, as well as with occupancy. West Aspen again is a standard OS. East Aspen is for trains going into and out of Wind River branch lines. Those two tracks will show occupied when one of the trains or one of the tracks is occupied, and dispatchers will need to pay attention to the call letters on the train tags, which will indicate whether or not a train is going into Wind River, and likewise with Fremont Branch, which we'll get to in a moment. Red Rocks is another intermediate signal. South Pass is our first unique signal. This signal here has a lunar going into the branch line. I also failed to note that there is also a lunar going into West Sage. We will get more into that in special operations. Again, Atlantic City is not detected, so the dispatcher would need to coordinate with any trains that are up there in issuing track warrants and making sure the tracks are clear for trains that are going through Atlantic City but not working or stopping. Midway Intermediate is another intermediate signal, just as Bridge Intermediate and Red Rocks is. Ashley Block and Ashley Siding are just two sidings that trains can use for going into and out of Atlantic City at the east end, coming off Lake Point. The switch at Atlantic City is not controlled by the dispatcher, nor is the switch going up to Wolf Branch. Those switches are all controlled by hand throw, and therefore the trains would need to throw those switches accordingly. Lake Point is one of the more complicated OSs. It has 3 tracks coming down in, as well as 3 tracks that interface with the Fremont Branch. When I say 3, you have the main, the Ashley Block main, and the Ashley siding, which are branch lines, as well as the Fremont branch. Those two are branch lines. Sweetwater, again, standard siding, standard OS. Foothill as well, standard OS and standard siding. From East Foothill, the Hudson looks like a long block, but it's comparatively the same distance as all the others. We only made it longer so that it would show up on the panel without splitting one of the OSs or one of the sidings in half. Hudson is the area where the double track mains go from double track to single track. Again, it's a standard OS. Just beyond that, on the main 2, we have Hudson Station track. That is an electric lock switch. And on main 1, we have Helper Pocket. That is an electric lock switch. Arapahoe Industrial Lead is a unique problem child of the layout, or a problem child of the dispatcher's panel, in that the dispatcher has no control over this whatsoever, and the crews are able to throw that switch as needed. There is no interlocking of it. To that point, we have a stop stick here which will go red and will block traffic from being able to use this section of track if it is left thrown, and it will show thrown here. We used to be able to have this on the panel, but it was giving us some grief with signal aspects. Therefore, this will now show as thrown, and it will show as occupied when the block is occupied. This will go red when the switch is thrown, and when the switch is not thrown, it will go at the color that it is now. West Riverton is another of our large OSs. It takes trains into and out of Riverton Yard, as well as being able to cross them over from main 1 to main 2 and opposite as needed. Most dispatchers will run trains eastbound on main 2, so there's no need to cross over. Realize, though, that if you have routed a train, such as an eastbound route here, you are going to be unable to throw a switch of either of the crossovers, and potentially only the the Riverton Yard lead switch, which is switch number 65. So once you have locked that up, you're not going to be able to throw a corresponding switch that is contained within this OS if it's being protected by a signal with a route lined through that particular switch. Riverton Yard, again, is not detected. East Riverton is the last OS, and this switch here, all trains going eastbound will have to be thrown, or will have to be routed from the yard or from main 1 up to main 2. You're not going to be able to run a train down the wrong way or eastbound on main 1 because of the nature of the Bonneville Junction westbound yard. At Bonneville Junction, we have 2 arrival tracks. These tracks are typically used for trains eastbound. However, on occasion it becomes necessary to route a train westbound. These 2 sections here, these 2 blocks, also contain the stopping blocks, and the stopping blocks will go red, which we will cover in special operations. Lander branch line contains trains which will go onto and off of the railroad. There's only 2 of them, a coal train onto and a coal train off of the main line. It comes out of Bonneville Junction. One item I did forget to note is the switch 0 up at West Sage. That switch up here is for the RDC, and that switch is thrown from the panel. It's not used very often, so it shouldn't be of concern, but if by chance the RDC is ran and the crew says they need that switch thrown, they will have to throw that from the panel, and it should be marked as indicated on the fascia panel for them to use. Getting back to Lander branch line, all other trains, the Lander turn and the Hudson local, all work this section of track under yard limits. Therefore, if a train contacts the dispatcher, instruct them to contact the Riverton Yard Master for authority to operate wherever they need to, since they are not under dispatcher's territory or under dispatcher's jurisdiction. And with that, we'll conclude this video. Thank you, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask.